In the heart of ancient Rome, punishment was not always about blood or death. Sometimes it was about something far crueler: humiliation. Picture a wife dragged from her husband's home into the open courtyard, where neighbors and relatives gather to watch. Her hair is ripped from its careful braids, her garments torn away, and her body exposed not for execution, but for disgrace. She is beaten, not to end her life, but to brand her with shame that would linger longer than scars. This was Rome's most humiliating punishment for wives, a ritual meant to strip away dignity, silence rebellion, and remind every woman that her honor belonged not to herself, but to her family and her husband. Rome, the empire famed for its laws, armies, and discipline, also perfected the art of control within the household. Wives were bound not only by marriage vows, but by a legal and cultural system that treated their obedience as essential to Rome's survival. But why did the empire, so advanced in governance, rely on humiliation to police women? Why was a wife's body turned into a stage for justice? Tonight, we uncover the truth behind the punishment Rome reserved for its wives. To understand why ancient Rome devised punishments of humiliation for wives, we must first understand the world in which Roman women lived. Rome was not merely a city of marble and legions. It was a civilization built upon order, hierarchy, and the authority of men. At the core of this system stood the Roman household, or domus, ruled with an iron hand by the paterfamilias, the father of the family. His authority was absolute. Under patria potestas, the legal doctrine that defined Roman family life, the husband or father wielded life and death power over everyone in the household, children, slaves, and wives alike. For a wife, marriage was less a partnership than a contract of control. Roman women did not marry for personal choice or romance. Marriage was a transaction between families, a way of preserving bloodlines, securing political alliances, and strengthening economic ties. A wife was expected to embody virtue, modesty, chastity, and obedience. Her honor was not her own, but belonged to her husband and, by extension, to her husband's lineage. A disobedient or unfaithful wife did not simply betray her husband, she dishonored an entire family and, by Roman logic, weakened the very foundation of society. The daily life of Roman wives reflected these expectations. They managed the household, oversaw slaves, and raised children, but always within the limits set by male authority. Respectable wives were expected to remain indoors, away from taverns, forums, and theatres, where looser women might be seen. Even their clothing reflected restraint. The stola, a long, modest garment, marked a woman as virtuous and married. To appear without it was to invite suspicion. Every detail of a wife's existence was designed to display obedience and chastity. But control extended far beyond appearances. Roman law treated wives as legal dependents. In early Rome, marriage often transferred a woman from the authority of her father to the complete legal authority of her husband. Even in later centuries, when some forms of marriage allowed wives to remain under their father's guardianship, the principle remained. Women were never fully autonomous. They were always tethered to male guardianship. A wife could not independently own property, draft contracts, or represent herself in court without a guardian. Her voice, like her body, was controlled. This system was justified not only by law but also by ideology. Roman writers and philosophers consistently portrayed women as morally weaker, emotionally unstable, and in need of guidance. The poet Juvenal mocked women who gossiped, schemed, or sought independence. Philosophers like Seneca and Cicero insisted that a wife's virtue lay in silence, modesty, and service. Even when praising women, authors did so in terms of their loyalty to husbands or fathers, never in terms of individuality. A virtuous woman was celebrated not for who she was, but for how well she reflected the power of men around her. This ideology was enforced through ritual and religion. Marriage ceremonies included vows where wives pledged obedience. Household gods, or lairs, were honored in rituals that reinforced family order. The state itself linked morality to women's behavior. The cult of Vesta, for example, placed priestesses in roles of chastity, symbolizing Rome's purity. When a Vestal virgin broke her vow, she was buried alive, a grim reminder that women, waxy bodies, were seen as vessels of Rome's survival. Though ordinary wives did not face burial, their own punishments echoed the same principle. Humiliation and suffering were tools to protect order. The expectations created immense pressure. Wives were measured not only by their actions, but by their reputation. A rumor of adultery could ruin a woman even if unproven. Neighbors, relatives, and slaves all acted as informal enforcers of morality. The Roman household was not private, it was porous, its reputation constantly under public scrutiny. To live as a wife in Rome was to live in a state of constant surveillance, where dignity was fragile and honor could be destroyed overnight. Against this backdrop, the punishments inflicted on wives make sense. When a wife defied her husband, whether through infidelity, disobedience, or even gossip, she did more than irritate him. She threatened the public honor of the family. And in Rome, honor was everything. To restore order, punishment had to be visible. It had to show the community that the husband retained control, that the family's reputation was defended, and that women knew their place. The humiliation of wives was not random cruelty, it was ritualized justice in a society that valued order above compassion. These punishments were also designed to be exemplary. Just as gladiators in the arena reminded Romans of discipline and power, the spectacle of a wife punished reminded women of obedience. Public humiliation was not only about the offender, but about every wife who watched. It said, "Your body belongs to your family. Your voice belongs to your husband. Your choices are not your own." In this way, the punishment served as cultural theater, reinforcing ideology through suffering. It is important to note that not all women in Rome lived identical lives. Elite wives had different expectations from lower-class wives. Wealthy matrons might wield influence behind the scenes, managing estates or advising husbands in politics. Some even appeared in public, sponsoring temples or festivals. Yet even they were bound by the same double standards. An elite woman who overstepped was ridiculed or punished more harshly because her example carried weight. For poorer women, punishment could be more immediate and brutal, with little recourse. In all cases, the message was clear. No wife, no matter her status, was beyond the reach of humiliation. The control of wives in Rome was ultimately about control of society itself. Roman leaders believed that strong families created a strong state. But strength was defined by hierarchy, discipline, and obedience. Women's independence was framed as weakness, disorder, even danger. Thus, humiliating punishments were not simply personal, they were political. They protected not just one husband's pride, but the ideology of Rome itself. In this context, the most humiliating punishment for wives was not an isolated cruelty. It was the natural extension of a society that equated obedience with virtue, silence with honor, and suffering with justice. To be a wife in Rome was to embody the order of the state and to suffer when that order was challenged. In the brutal logic of ancient Rome, punishment was not always about ending life. Sometimes it was about destroying reputation, stripping dignity, and ensuring that shame lived longer than wounds. For wives, humiliation was the most terrifying weapon because it turned their bodies, the very vessels of family honor, into instruments of disgrace. The punishments inflicted on them were designed not only to correct, but to display, to transform private betrayal into public theater. The most humiliating of these punishments was public exposure combined with ritual degradation. A wife accused of adultery or disobedience could be dragged into the atrium of her husband's home or even into the street before neighbors and kin. Her hair, which in Roman culture symbolized modesty and honor, was ripped from its careful braids and hacked short. In Roman society, loose or shorn hair marked grief, slavery, or shame. To cut a wife's hair was to strip her of status, branding her as dishonored in front of all who watched. Clothing, too, was weaponized. The dignified stola that marked a married woman could be ripped away, replaced with the rough cloak of a prostitute, the toga muliebris. By forcing a wife to wear this garment, society proclaimed that she no longer held the dignity of a matron, but the infamy of a sex worker. This symbolic transformation was devastating because it meant her identity was not just tarnished, but inverted. She went from respected wife to despised outsider in a single act of clothing. Physical punishment followed. Beatings were common, though Roman law distinguished sharply between striking a slave and striking a free citizen. For wives, the line blurred. Husbands possessed near total authority under patria potestas. Whippings with rods or leather thongs could be administered in the presence of witnesses. The blows were not necessarily meant to kill, but to mark. Bruises, welts, and blood were visible signs of dishonor. Neighbors could see them, whisper about them, and remember them long after the wounds healed. Public processions added another layer of humiliation. In some cases, adulterous wives were paraded through the streets, half naked, accompanied by jeers, insults, and laughter. Their shame was amplified not by the pain of punishment, but by the eyes of the crowd. Roman society thrived on spectacle, from gladiatorial combat to triumphal parades. Punishing wives in public mirrored this love of theatre, turning domestic rebellion into a civic lesson. Exile from the household was another weapon of shame. A wife accused of adultery could be expelled, stripped of dowry, and cast out without support. In Rome, where family defined survival, exile was a social death. She might live physically, but without protection, status, or community, she was effectively destroyed. The humiliation was compounded by poverty and isolation, forcing her into dependence on relatives or into prostitution. The poet Juvenal, with his biting satire, described wives punished for infidelity with scorn and ridicule. While his accounts are colored by exaggeration, they reveal cultural attitudes. The punishment was meant not only to hurt, but to entertain. The humiliation of wives became part of public discourse, fuel for gossip and moralizing. Their disgrace was not private, it was communal property, something Rome consumed with relish. Roman legal texts provide further insight. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis, introduced under Augustus, criminalized adultery and placed harsh penalties on wives. A husband who discovered his wife's infidelity was required by law to divorce her and could even kill her under certain circumstances. If he spared her, he was expected to prosecute her publicly. Failure to do so endangered his own reputation. Thus, punishment was not only an option, but a duty. By punishing his wife, a man defended his own honor and his family's standing. By humiliating her, he preserved his place in Roman society. Cases survive in the writings of historians. One notorious account tells of a husband who beat his wife publicly for drinking wine, an act that Roman culture equated with sexual immorality. The punishment was not for drunkenness, but for violating the ideal of the modest matron. Another tale, though likely embellished, describes a woman paraded through the forum with signs declaring her an adulteress. These stories, whether factual or exaggerated, reveal the central role of spectacle in punishing wives. The rituals carried symbolic weight. Haircutting symbolized the loss of dignity. Clothing transformations symbolized moral inversion. Beatings symbolized submission. Exile symbolized social death. Each act was designed to target not just the body, but the essence of what it meant to be a Roman wife. Unlike executions or imprisonments, These punishments did not remove women from society entirely. Instead, they left them alive as living reminders of dishonor. The humiliation extended beyond the individual to her entire family. A disgraced wife stained her husband, children, and lineage. Her shame was inherited, creating ripples that spread across generations. Families went to great lengths to conceal scandals, but when exposure was unavoidable, punishment became a way to contain the damage. By humiliating the wife, the family attempted to cleanse itself. Her suffering became a sacrificial act, purging dishonor from the household. It is striking to compare these punishments to those inflicted on men. Roman men who committed adultery were rarely punished with humiliation. They might face fines or political consequences if caught with married women of high status, but their masculinity was not ridiculed. In fact, male infidelity was often celebrated as virility. Women's sexuality, by contrast, was policed as property. A wife's body belonged to her husband and his family. Her betrayal was treated as theft, and her punishment as restitution. The humiliation she endured was the price of restoring balance. This gendered double standard reveals the logic of Rome's most humiliating punishments for wives. They were not primarily about justice, but about control. By shaming wives in public, Roman society reinforced the patriarchal order. Every lash of the rod, every lock of hair cut, every mocking procession sent a message. Women's honor was fragile, dependent on obedience, and always subject to male authority. The cruelty lay not only in the punishments themselves, but in their normalization. For Romans, these acts were not considered excessive, but necessary. Just as gladiatorial games satisfied the need for discipline through blood, the humiliation of wives satisfied the need for order through shame. Society accepted these rituals because they reinforced hierarchy. They were seen not as brutality, but as morality. For the women who endured them, however, the experience must have been devastating. To be stripped before neighbors, to feel the sting of lashes, to hear laughter at one's disgrace, these were punishments that lingered in memory long after the event ended. The scars were not just physical, but social, psychological, and generational. Thus, the most humiliating punishment for wives in ancient Rome was not a single act, but a system, a combination of exposure, ritual degradation, physical violence, and exile. It turned the body into a billboard of shame, the household into a courtroom, and the community into an audience. It was justice as theater, humiliation as law, and obedience as the ultimate goal. In ancient Rome, punishment was never distributed equally between men and women. For wives, shame was a weapon, humiliation a sentence, and obedience the expectation. For husbands, the same actions often carried no consequence at all. The contrast was staggering. In a culture that celebrated its laws and discipline, justice itself was built on double standards that elevated male authority and silenced female independence. To understand the humiliating punishments wives endured, we must see them alongside the freedoms men enjoyed. Consider adultery, perhaps the clearest example of Rome's gendered divide. If a wife strayed, the consequences were severe. She could be beaten, stripped, paraded, or exiled. Her body became the stage for public disgrace. But if a husband strayed, Roman culture often looked the other way. Men were permitted relationships with slaves, concubines, and prostitutes without censure. The same act that branded a woman as immoral often branded a man as virile. In Rome, sexual control was about property, not equality. A wife's fidelity protected her husband's lineage and inheritance, while a husband's fidelity was irrelevant. Roman law codified this double standard. Under Augustus's Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis, wives caught in adultery faced exile and the loss of dowry. Husbands who failed to punish adulterous wives could be prosecuted themselves for negligence. By contrast, men faced punishment only if they seduced another man's wife or violated the social hierarchy. Sleeping with a prostitute or slave was not considered adultery at all. A man could indulge freely, while a wife risked ruin for even the suspicion of desire. The power of the husband extended far beyond the bedroom. Under patria potestas, he held life and death authority over the household. If he chose to kill a wife for adultery, Roman custom often protected him. Even if the killing was excessive, courts were reluctant to interfere. The assumption was simple: the husband's honor justified the act. Wives, on the other hand, had no such rights. A woman could not punish her husband for infidelity, neglect, or abuse. Her silence was enforced both by law and by fear. The double standards went further. Consider alcohol. Roman culture associated women's drinking with immorality. A wife caught tasting wine could be punished as if she had committed adultery. Some accounts suggest husbands killed wives who drank, equating wine with sexual looseness. Yet men drank freely, celebrated for their toasts in taverns, honored for their banquets. A cup in a wife's hand was scandal. A cup in a husband's was status. Even in matters of speech, the divide was stark. Wives accused of gossiping or speaking too boldly could be humiliated, muzzled, or mocked. The satirist Juvenal described women who talked back to husbands as monstrous, needing correction. Silence was framed as a virtue for wives, but eloquence was celebrated in men. Senators, orators, and generals built careers on speech. For women, words were crimes. For men, they were weapons of glory. This imbalance extended to divorce. Husbands could divorce wives with relative ease, often with little explanation. A wife accused of disobedience might be sent away, stripped of dowry, and left destitute. But wives faced immense barriers in seeking divorce. While technically possible in certain legal contexts, it was rare and socially stigmatized. To leave a husband was to abandon honor, children, and family. Even when abused or neglected, wives were pressured to endure. Husbands wielded the law, wives bore its weight. The symbolism of punishment reflected these inequalities. Husbands who erred might face fines, but their masculinity remained intact. Their reputations could be repaired through military service, political success, or public generosity. Wives, however, carried disgrace permanently. A public beating, a shorn head, or exile left scars not only on the body but on the family name. A man's mistakes could be overshadowed by victories. A woman's mistakes became her identity. These double standards were reinforced by ideology. Roman writers like Cato the Elder openly declared that wives must be controlled. He argued that if men allowed women freedom in small matters, they would soon demand equality in all matters. Juvenal mocked women who sought independence, portraying them as dangerous temptresses. Philosophers like Seneca, though more nuanced, still praised silence and obedience in wives as moral ideals. The cultural consensus was clear: male power was natural, female submission necessary. Even religion reflected this divide. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses, were revered but tightly controlled. A Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was buried alive, while the man involved often escaped with less severe punishment. The symbolism was unmistakable. Women carried the burden of purity. Men carried the privilege of indulgence. This religious framing reinforced the same pattern seen in law and custom. In practice, the double standards shaped daily life. Men frequented taverns, theatres, and bathhouses. Wives were expected to stay home. Men commanded armies, debated in the Senate, and travelled abroad. Wives were confined to household management. Men could remake their reputations through action. Wives had no such path. Their honor was fragile, easily lost, and nearly impossible to regain. This imbalance made humiliation a particularly powerful weapon against wives. Because their dignity was tied entirely to obedience and chastity, public punishment destroyed not only their reputation but their very identity. A wife stripped of honor was stripped of self. For men, dishonor was a setback. For women, it was annihilation. The double standard made humiliation lethal in ways that physical pain was not. The hypocrisy of Roman culture was visible even to some contemporaries. Critics noted that while Rome punished wives harshly for adultery, its streets overflowed with brothels and slaves exploited for male pleasure. The state turned a blind eye to men's indulgence while parading women for shame. Yet few challenged the system openly because it was the very foundation of Roman patriarchy. To question it was to question Rome itself. The result was a society where punishment functioned less as justice and more as performance. Husbands enforced honor through humiliation, wives endured it in silence, men flaunted freedom as virility, women carried obedience as virtue. This double standard was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. It preserved hierarchy, reinforced control, and ensured that women remained subordinate. When we look back at Rome's humiliating punishments for wives, we must see them not in isolation, but as part of this larger framework. The cruelty was real, but so was the hypocrisy. Husbands who demanded silence for wives spoke freely themselves. Husbands who punished infidelity indulged without fear. Husbands who beat wives for drinking feasted in taverns. The law, religion, and culture all conspired to protect male privilege while criminalizing female independence. This is the true context of Rome's most humiliating punishments. They were not merely about disciplining one woman, but about preserving a system of inequality. They exposed the fragility of male honor, which required constant policing of women's behavior to survive. And they revealed the cost. Wives stripped of dignity, punished for desires men were free to indulge, silenced in a culture that celebrated speech for men but criminalized it for women. Every lash of the rod, every lock of hair cut, every garment torn from a wife in ancient Rome carried meaning. Punishment was never just about pain, it was about symbols. Romans believed that order was maintained not only through force, but through ritualized acts that demonstrated control. To humiliate a wife was to make her body speak a language of obedience, fear, and dishonor. That symbolism resonated far beyond the individual woman. It reached into the heart of Roman culture and projected power across generations. At the center of this symbolism was the belief that women's bodies represented more than themselves. A Roman wife was not seen as an independent person, but as the vessel of her family's honor, the guardian of her husband's reputation, and the bearer of legitimate heirs. Her chastity guaranteed the purity of lineage. Her modesty reflected the strength of her household. Her silence affirmed the dominance of male authority. When she transgressed, punishment had to be public, not only to shame her, but to cleanse the stain on her entire family. The body of one woman became a canvas on which the state painted its lessons of morality. Hair, for example, was deeply symbolic. To unbraid or cut a wife's hair was to strip her of dignity and status. Loose hair marked madness, mourning, or disgrace. Shorn hair marked slavery or punishment. When a wife's locks were ripped away, it was not merely an act of cruelty, it was a ritual of transformation. She ceased to be a matron, adorned and dignified, and became a figure of dishonor. The act proclaimed, her virtue is gone, her obedience shattered, her body reclaimed by male authority. Clothing, too, spoke volumes. The stola signified virtue and respectability. To remove it and replace it with a prostitute's toga was to invert her identity completely. The symbolism was brutal. She who was wife is now whore. She who belonged to one man now belongs to none. The punishment reduced her to a category despised by society, erasing the honor that once clothed her body. This transformation was not about fabric, but about meaning. Clothing became language, telling the community how to interpret her disgrace. Even the whip carried symbolic weight. Each strike was more than physical pain, it was a declaration of submission. Romans viewed discipline as essential to order, both in the military and the household. A beaten wife mirrored a flogged soldier. Both were reminders that authority must be obeyed, that hierarchy was sacred, and that disobedience carried visible costs. In this way, punishment linked the smallest unit of society, the family, to the largest, the empire. Discipline at home reflected discipline in the state. Public humiliation amplified these symbols. To parade a wife through streets or forums was to transform her into living propaganda. The crowd did not simply watch, it participated. Laughter, jeers, and gossip spread the message that women's independence was dangerous and that obedience was safety. Public punishment made one woman's body a cautionary tale for every other wife. It created a culture of surveillance where women policed themselves out of fear. The humiliation of the few preserved the silence of the many. This symbolic system reveals why Rome relied so heavily on humiliation. Execution removed a wife permanently, but it also ended her capacity to serve as a warning. Humiliation, by contrast, left her alive but diminished. She remained a living testimony to male power, carrying her disgrace into daily life. Every neighbor who saw her shorn hair, every relative who remembered her public beating, reinforced the hierarchy. Her survival was not mercy but strategy. Her existence in disgrace preserved order more effectively than her death. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond Rome itself. Later cultures borrowed Roman ideas of symbolic punishment, especially for women. Medieval Europe embraced public shaming rituals like the scold's bridle, the ducking stool, and the cucking chair, all devices that, like Roman punishments, targeted speech, sexuality, and disobedience. Hair-cutting rituals reappeared in the Middle Ages when adulteresses and prostitutes were shorn before crowds. Even in modern times, echoes persist. During World War II, women accused of consorting with enemy soldiers had their heads shaved in public squares across Europe. The act was Roman in essence: humiliation through hair, disgrace through spectacle. The Roman legacy also influenced legal and moral codes. The idea that women's sexuality defined family honor persisted for centuries. In many cultures, adultery remained a crime for women but not for men. Double standards in punishment survived long after the fall of Rome, rooted in the same symbolic logic: control women's bodies to control society. Roman law may no longer be enforced, but its cultural DNA still shapes attitudes toward gender and morality. Religion carried the symbolism even further. Christianity, which grew within the Roman world, absorbed and reinterpreted many of these ideas. The emphasis on female chastity, obedience, and silence found reinforcement in early Christian writings. Stories of Eve's sin, Mary's purity, and the silence of women in churches echoed Roman anxieties about control. Though the punishments changed form, the symbolic system endured. Women were vessels of honor, obedience was demanded, and humiliation was the price of defiance. The endurance of this legacy can be seen in modern debates. Women who defy norms are often shamed publicly, whether through media, gossip, or online harassment. A woman's clothing, hair, or sexuality is still weaponized against her. The Roman obsession with symbolism survives in subtle but powerful ways. Just as a wife's hair once marked obedience, a woman's appearance today is judged as a measure of virtue. Just as a wife's silence was once demanded, women today are often criticized as shrill or disruptive when they speak too boldly. The tools have changed, but the symbols remain. The legacy of humiliation also lies in its invisibility. We often remember Rome for its laws, its roads, its conquests. Yet the empire also perfected systems of control that left no monuments. The stones of the Colosseum still stand, but the scars of wives punished in courtyards have long vanished. Their humiliation survives only in fragments of text, anecdotes in satire, or whispers in law codes. And yet, these fragments reveal a truth. Rome's greatness was built not only on armies but on households, and those households were maintained by controlling women. The symbolism of humiliating punishments tells us something profound about power. Power is not only about swords and laws, it is about stories, rituals, and symbols that shape how people see the world. By humiliating wives, Rome told a story that women's independence was dangerous, that obedience was sacred, and that male authority was unquestionable. That story outlived the punishments themselves, echoing through history, shaping culture long after the iron rods had rusted. Ultimately, the legacy of Rome's humiliating punishments is not confined to antiquity. It lives in every culture that equates women's honor with silence, every ritual that punishes defiance through shame, every law that treats women's bodies as property. The symbols may change, but the logic remains. Rome's lesson was simple. Control the body to control the household to control the state. By humiliating wives, Rome reminded itself that order began at home and that women's voices were the first threat to silence. The streets of ancient Rome no longer echo with the cries of wives paraded in disgrace, yet the logic that once justified their humiliation has not disappeared. The tools have changed, no more rods, no more shorn hair under the public gaze, but the instinct to discipline women through shame lingers. The iron masks and public floggings of antiquity have given way to subtler, yet equally corrosive, forms of silencing. In many ways, Rome never left us. It merely adapted, embedding its double standards into new languages, new institutions, and new technologies. Consider the modern courtroom. In some countries, laws still place women at the mercy of honor codes that echo the Roman principle of patria potestas. A husband or family may claim the right to punish a woman for adultery, dress, or independence. Though the methods vary from exile to violence, the underlying logic remains Roman. A woman's body is not her own but the property of her family. Just as the Romans demanded public punishment to restore honor, so too do modern communities justify shaming rituals, forced confessions, or even honor killings as acts of purification. The digital world has created its own arenas of humiliation. Where once a Roman crowd gathered in a forum, today millions gather online. Women who speak out in politics, journalism, or activism often find themselves targeted with harassment campaigns. Their words are twisted, their reputations dragged through digital mud, their personal lives exposed. The crowd that once jeered in the marketplace now floods comment sections and social media feeds. The goal is the same: to silence women by making speech unbearable. Instead of rods and shears, the weapons are insults, threats, and relentless noise. Modern media amplifies these patterns. Women who defy norms are scrutinized not for their achievements, but for their appearance, clothing, or tone of voice. A male leader may be praised for passion. A female leader is condemned as shrill. A male celebrity may flaunt affairs. A female celebrity is branded immoral. These double standards are not new. They are Roman legacies dressed in 21st century fashion. Rome taught us that men's reputations could survive indulgence, but women's honor was fragile, easily shattered, and permanently stained. That lesson endures. Even religion carries echoes of Roman humiliation. In communities where women are still expected to remain silent in places of worship, or where their worth is tied to chastity and obedience, we see the persistence of ancient logic. The Vestal Virgins of Rome may be gone, but the idea that women's virtue is the cornerstone of communal purity remains alive. When women are punished disproportionately for moral failings, it is the Roman legacy of symbolic control resurfacing under a new name. But modern reflections are not only about oppression, they are also about resistance. Unlike Roman wives, today's women often have tools to fight back. Social media, while a platform for harassment, is also a platform for defiance. Movements like Me Too have shown how women can reclaim their voices, turning shame into solidarity, humiliation into exposure of injustice. Where Roman wives were forced into silence, modern women amplify each other, refusing to let humiliation remain private. This too is a legacy one not of Rome, but against it. Yet the danger of romanticizing progress must be avoided. Too often societies congratulate themselves on having abolished public whippings or exile, forgetting that humiliation remains deeply embedded in cultural practices. Schoolgirls shamed for dress codes, women judged harshly for sexual choices, female victims of assault interrogated about their behavior. These are modern bridles and rods. They may not leave bruises, but they leave scars just as deep. Rome's obsession with symbolic control is not a relic of the past, but a framework we still inhabit. The persistence of humiliation reveals something unsettling about human nature. Shame is a cheap and effective tool of control. It requires no armies, no prisons, only an audience willing to watch and a community willing to believe. Rome understood this, and so do modern societies. Humiliation polices behavior not through force, but through fear, teaching people to self-censor, to shrink themselves before the crowd can strike. For women, this fear has been magnified for centuries, inherited like an invisible chain. There are also haunting parallels in politics. Female leaders are often subjected to scrutiny of their private lives, clothing, or family choices standards rarely applied to men. Campaigns of ridicule, cartoons exaggerating their features, and debates about their femininity echo Rome's tradition of satire and public mockery. Juvenal once mocked Roman wives for their voices and desires. Modern media outlets do the same, cloaking ridicule in humor or commentary. The tools have shifted, but the logic has not. Discredit the woman, diminish her voice, and protect the hierarchy. And yet, history also provides hope. Just as myths of Rome's cruelty were preserved, so too were stories of resistance. Some Roman wives endured humiliation but refused to vanish, their names preserved in fragments of history. Others whispered truths in private, passing knowledge to daughters and friends. Their voices, though silenced in public, survived in shadows. Today, women carry that legacy forward, insisting that humiliation will not erase them. Every protest, every speech, every story told is a rejection of Rome's lesson that shame equals silence. Ultimately, modern reflections on Roman humiliation force us to confront a question: how far have we really come? On the surface, we have abolished the public rituals of disgrace that Rome embraced. We no longer parade wives in forums or strip them of garments before neighbors. But beneath the surface, the logic persists. Shame is still wielded as a weapon. Double standards still shape expectations. Women's voices are still policed more harshly than men's. The challenge, then, is not only to recognize Rome's legacy, but to break it, to see that humiliation is not justice but domination, to refuse the rituals of shaming that silence women in new guises, to remember that every double standard upheld today is another echo of Rome's past. The empire may have fallen, but its culture of humiliation survives wherever shame is used as control. In the end, the most humiliating punishments for wives in ancient Rome are not confined to history books. They are alive in every moment when a woman is shamed for speaking, for desiring, for existing outside prescribed roles. They are alive in every culture that ties honor to obedience, every law that punishes female autonomy, every insult hurled to silence dissent. Rome's legacy is both warning and mirror, showing us how deeply humiliation can shape societies and how urgently it must be resisted